Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another author interview here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and Wandering Scribe. And today we have another guest from LA Comicon. My guest has been writing since he was a middle schooler, and he learned to make novels at the University of Southern California, the closest he could get to attending Hogwarts in the real world. He has worked as an editor, screenwriter, director, producer, college professor, and pizza delivery technician. He currently lives in LA with his wife and two sons, who thankfully like to read. And in this interview, we'll be talking about a book that I am very excited to showcase on the show in a future episode, Sorcery for Beginners, which, if you can tell by the cover, it's simply amazing. And I can't wait to can't wait to dive into this book and share with you my thoughts and everything. And without further ado, let me introduce the author of Sorcery for Beginners, Mr. Matt Henry. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Gabriel. I'm excited to talk about books and writing and all kinds of things.
Awesome. So before we dive into Sorcery for Beginners, is there anything else you'd like to add about your background as a writer, a storyteller, anything else in particular?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like I have kind of an unusual writing career in that I do a lot of different things. And this has always been kind of like a challenge, I think, because people, especially on the sales marketing side, like to kind of put people in a category. It's like this person writes fantasy, this person does sci-fi novels or whatever. And I've just always been interested in a lot of different kinds of things. So I really have kind of like a wide range of experience. Like I've done plays, I've done novels, I've done movies, short films. Again, like you said, I've had a lot of different jobs. So I just kind of I keep hopping around to different things that I like.
Awesome. And speaking of your works as an author, can you give us a little teaser into this series that you've written, Sorcery for Beginners, as well as the other books that are in the series for our viewers and listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Sorcery for Beginners, my very quick pitch is it's kind of like The Goonies, but with magic, if you know that movie. Unlike kind of Harry Potter, it's much more about kids figuring it out on their own. So this group of kids finds a help guide to magic, and then they have to learn how to use it without any schools or teachers or anything like that. So there's currently 3 books in the series. The second one is Cryptozoology for Beginners. And
Nice. I love
third
it.
one we just did a Kickstarter campaign for, which is Time Travel for Beginners. So each one is kind of like a chance to explore kind of a fantastic fantasy idea like magical creatures or time
Mm.
travel or necromancy through the lens of like a fun story. And the books are actually laid out like help guides as well. So you've got like spells inside them and little sidebar information and illustrations and things like that. Sorry, my camera blurring is going off and on. So yeah, they're just really fun to work on, and kind of each one is a chance to kind of do a deep dive into a different supernatural topic.
Awesome. And I think that's really, really cool. And going back to what you said about, writing different things, doing different things, and trying to branch out, that's something we'll talk about later in the interview when we come to the business side. But before we get to that, let's actually talk a little bit more about you, Matt. So in your bio, it said that you have been writing since you were a middle schooler and you honed your craft or started honing your craft writing stories in college. So would you say you've always been a creative person growing up?
I feel I have been. I mean, it was weird when I was very young. I would just get interested in writing down little stories, like on my free time, like not for class. Just I was always very much driven towards that. Whether it was like doing little newsletters for what was happening on my block growing up, or writing little short stories or plays or things like that. I kind of, I think, got into it through acting when I was young. I did theater when I was very young, like third grade to sixth, seventh grade, and through high school. And then I remember seeing there was a book called This Can't Be Happening at McDonald Hall, which was like a middle grade book. And I remember reading the bio, and the bio said the author had written it when he was in seventh grade and got it published.
Wow.
And I was like, well, if that guy can do it, which is probably a little egotistical on my part. So I did end up writing a novel when I was in seventh grade, which never got published, deservedly so, because it's not very good. But I've always kind of had that attitude of like, not just writing stuff for myself, but like kind of trying to finish things and then send it out. So when I was in high school, I actually wrote movie reviews and I did interviews for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, which is
Ooh,
like
okay.
paper. They had like a teen section. And so I got to interview Tom Hanks when I was 16. I got to go to movie premieres that were happening in Cleveland and stuff. So that was really cool. I never really thought about kind of fiction so much because I didn't know anybody who did it. And it wasn't until I went to college and I realized there were like people who make movies and there's a whole point to movies. And that's where I kind of got into movies for quite a long time. I went to film school, like you said, at University of Southern California. And then I graduated. I worked for many years as an editor. I worked on The Bachelor. I worked on a bunch of other shows. And then I was always trying to write at the same time. And then around 2012, I remember I pitched a script idea to my agent at the time. And he kind of said, yeah, no, no one's buying like original specs like this. Like it was the Sorcery for Beginners idea. It was like, a big fantasy idea. And he's like, if I would say if this was based on something great, but you want to write like original spec. And I remember driving home being angry, and I'm like, I'll just write a book then. And then that took quite a long time because I hadn't done it since I was in seventh grade. But after about 4 years of doing that, I sent it around and it ended up getting published by kind of an indie publisher called Inkshares. And then that book, ironically, ended up getting optioned a couple years later, and I was hired to write it as a TV pilot. So it kind of came full circle eventually. But yeah, and ever since then, I feel like now, like I teach film classes, and I tell my students a lot of times, like if you have an idea for a script, think about doing it as a book, because having a physical thing that you can show people, it just really changes the conversation. I remember going to these meetings and people I meet with before who were like, yeah, thanks for writing the script. We'll let you know if anything happens. Suddenly with a book, they're like, who do you think should direct it? Who do you think should be in it? I was like, oh my God. It's like, you just have a different, I don't know, there's like a different weight to it, I think, if you have like a whole published book.
Definitely. Now, would you say that moment you had with your agent at the time was sort of your aha moment to create this original story and also develop it into its own series?
I think the big moment for that was I was eating lunch one day and I was kind of flipping through this book that my wife had, which was called The Idiot's Guide to Understanding Einstein, I think it was. And I was reading about this and I was like figuring out all these things that were really, really difficult that I could never figure out in school because it was explaining them in this kind of dumbed down way. And I immediately had the idea, like, if this book can explain, the theory of relativity to me, who was never a good science student, what if there was a book that could explain something that wasn't real? Like time travel or magic creatures. And then I was like, or magic. And I immediately was like
Oh,
magic. And I
okay.
was like, oh my God, The Idiot's Guide to Understanding Magic. Like, that would be so cool. And then, of course, I was like, well, I can't call it The Idiot's Guide because
Right,
that's
right.
mean to the readers. But once I had that idea of like kind of explaining a complicated topic to kids, very quickly I was like, I had all these ideas for different novels. And then so I was very inspired to write the draft. And then as I was writing it, after 2 drafts, I realized, oh, the book should actually be like a help guide as well. So it can do 2 things at once. So it took a while because it was such a big transition, I think, going from writing
Mm.
screenplays to writing prose. But once I kind of locked into that, it really made like the whole series kind of just flow.
Awesome. And speaking of the draft for Sorcery for Beginners, let's actually talk about that process. So when you sat down and began drafting the initial outlines of Sorcery for Beginners, what were the goals you had, not just for yourself as the author, but also goals and promises to prospective readers who would pick up this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, I'm a big believer in outlines. I know there's a thing in the writing community about, are you a plotter or a pantser? You know, do you
Yes.
write by the seat of your pants or do you plot it out beforehand? I'm kind of like a plotting pantser. I'm kind of in the
Hmm.
middle because I do like to have an outline. I like to know the shape of the whole story. But then on the actual page work, I like to leave it a little bit open for discovery and finding things. Like I always like to say, it's like my characters will say something. It's like, oh, I didn't know that about you. That's really interesting. You know, like it really does feel like the characters are talking through you if you let them. And I think my goal with writing it was I didn't want to write a book that felt like a kid's book.
Mm.
Because I actually like to read a lot of kids' books. You know, like I remember being very excited when the Harry Potter series was coming out, and I was in my 20s, you know, when those books were being published. But I was like their opening line to like, I was so excited to read those stories as they were coming out. And there's other books like that as well, like the Philip Pullman, His Dark Materials. Like those
Yes.
are kind of for kids, but not really. Like there's a lot of stuff
Mm.
going on in them that I think goes over the heads of a lot of kids. So those two series, I think, were really big North Stars for me. Where it was like, I want to. This is obviously the intended audience is for kids, but I want anybody to be able to read it and enjoy it. And so I want there to be stakes. I want it to be fun, and I want it to be, you know, kind of surprising and like not talking down to the audience at all.
Right. And readership is something that we will touch also in the business portion of the interview. So thank you for bringing that up, Matt. Now, let's actually fast forward a little bit. So you've now got the illustrations for your book, you got it formatted to exactly the way you want it, and it's now out there on the digital stage. What was the initial reaction like from readers? Were they positive, negative, or were they somewhere in the middle? And as an add on to that question, did their reviews, no matter what side they were, validate the goals that you had going forward with this book?
Hmm. Yeah, I think largely it was pretty positive. I did not probably. I should have thought about this a little bit more. But I was so excited to get a book out. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about like how should I approach these reviews? Like how should I not read them? Should I read them? Like I didn't do a lot of mental health kind of check-in stuff before the book came out because I think it was such a big it's such a big process to like get a book out, and it kept changing through production too. So, like I said, I was like, I wrote the novel. I kind of was sending it around to places. Then I was like, maybe I should add spell pages to it. And so my wife, who's a graphic designer, helped me with those. And then our publisher was like, what about cool footnotes? And so I added a bunch of footnotes. And then they were like, what about illustrations? And so we added some of those as well. So it was a very big process leading up to it. And then when it came out, I think we had a lot of good response. Like I think, and the thing I didn't realize at the time was that debuts are always a big deal. It's
Mm-hmm.
like there's this new person and they're writing this new novel, and so we got a lot of like, a lot of cool stuff. Like it was featured on the end of a year list on BuzzFeed. We got a nice review from Publishers Weekly. We had a nice review from like several other like big outlets. And then I think even the first week we managed to get to like number one in the category. Again, that was like kind of the publisher sets up all these categories on Amazon. So all that was cool. Of course, me being a writer, there were a couple of reviews that were on the negative side that I remember those better, I feel like,
Right.
than the positive ones. Um, and some of them were like things I was actually intending to be positive, people kind of misinterpreted occasionally, which was a surprise. Like I wanted to, I think, like I said, the edginess of it, I wanted to do
Mm.
something that could kind of be read by adults. And some people were like, this feels too edgy. This feels like too violent for a kid's book. And so there were definitely those reactions. I feel like another thing that was really cool to see later on was once it was out for a while, I started seeing like librarians would contact me and they would
Mm.
say, "I have to tell you, my kids check this out from the library, and I see them in the playground doing the spells that are in the pages, like they're doing the hand motions and stuff." And so that was something I didn't really expect, but that was really cool. I had someone, the daughter of a friend of mine, had to do a dress as your favorite book character for school, and she dressed as
Ooh,
like
that's
a
nice.
character from my book. So it's like that's the kind of thing you never think is going to happen. but that like it affected a kid so much they wanted to dress up as that character. So that was really cool. That kind of stuff was unexpected and fun.
That's awesome. I wish I had that kind of day at my school, but I will say if someone tried to dress up as one of my characters from my books, they would have to go to a costume store first because all my characters are like in armor,
Right,
like
right.
knights, dragons, and all that stuff. So, and it's for school. It's like I'm pretty sure some of the accessories would have to stay at home, but that's amazing, Matt. I'm really, really happy for you because that's an incredible feeling and experience. And going back to what you said, as holding something that is yours, a physical copy of a passion project, it's amazing. And that leads into the first reflective question, which I'm eager to hear your thoughts on, which is, as writers and as authors, this career is not a get rich quick scheme. It's hours and hours, if not years and decades of just writing something, even the first outline and draft of the story, and then formatting it, getting everything the way you want it from, the ISBNs, finding illustrations from artists to put into your book, anything like that. That all takes a lot of time and money, regardless of if you go independent, hybrid, or traditional. And then ultimately, now in the modern age, social media is a huge thing for authors. It allows us to showcase our work. But I definitely feel that because of social media, there is that level of, anxiety and hesitancy if it's going to be received well or not. And of course, the imposter syndrome is more apparent now in the digital age because everyone's going to make either like comparisons to other books or say, oh, this isn't good or something along those lines. We internalize it saying, well, shoot, no one's really going to like it, no one's really going to take this book seriously, and so forth. So I'm wondering for you, Matt, not only when you finish writing and publishing the first book, Sources for Beginners, but also the other two books in your series, Cryptozoology for Beginners and Time Travel for Beginners. With all of that, what has disciplined you to continue writing and telling this story? And have you ever had moments of self-doubt, anxiety, or imposter syndrome during the process of writing these books?
Yeah. Well, first to answer the second part, absolutely, 100%. Like, I think it's so hard being a writer because it's all you. You're like
Yes.
the boss and the sole employee and the marketing and the everything, and it's really hard to wear all those hats. And I find that most people are kind of good at a couple of those things. They're not good at everything. And whether it's like someone's a really good writer, they can hunker down, they can crank out pages, or someone's a really good marketer, or someone's really good, in a meeting. And so I think you have to, it's really helpful to identify the skills that you're good at. And then the ones that you're not so good at, maybe you can kind of bring people on to help with that, or you can learn how to do stuff. The good thing about novels, as opposed to the other thing that I went to school to learn, filmmaking, is like you can do it by
Yeah.
yourself and you can do it cheaply. And you can create a quality product. It does not take a ton of money. Whereas films, it's like I was having a conversation last week about a script I was writing, and my manager was like, "Well, it might be very low budget. It's only going to be 7 million." And it's like that's crazy. Like that definitely will be low budget. It's going to be hard and scrappy, and we have to change the script probably. But $7 million for a book, like insane. You could buy like
Yes.
a blimp. That would be like dropping books on people for free for 7 million. So they're just very different in that way. I would say that for me, it's like had this. I really like to continue to get stuff out,
Mm.
and for me, it doesn't really like. This was the great thing about books is I spent 10 years writing scripts and selling scripts and having scripts optioned, and they never got made into movies. And so it really felt like I'm doing this thing and like I'm making some money from it, but it's not real. Like no one's ever going to go see that. Even my parents
Right.
were like, I remember sending my mom a screenplay in undergrad, and she was like, I don't know what this is. I don't know how to read this. What's int? What's ext? But when I had a book, suddenly it was like this real thing that like
Right.
people could go into an airport and they're like, oh my God, I saw your book. And they like take a picture and send it to you. Or I've had people in Norway and Tasmania like buy the book online and walk it out to some place and take pictures of it. So that's just really, really cool. So the idea that you can make something and that sometime in the future it will be real for people, and it's like having a conversation over long distance in a way over time. And that's
Right.
kind of what keeps me going, keep me wanting to put stuff out.
Awesome. That's actually really, really cool. And now we arrive at the business portion of the author interview, which I'm eager to hear your thoughts on. I always love this segment of the interview because even though the questions are the same, I give the same questions to all my guests, the answers are very different and unique. So I'm eager to hear your thoughts on these questions. So, as a little icebreaker, the first question I always ask my guests is, what route did you go for your journey as an author? Independent, traditional, hybrid? And it seems to me from what you told me that the press you gone with, I imagine it's a small traditional press that you went for sorcery and beginners. Okay. So when you finished the book and you were about to publish it, what was now the business side of it, researching which house would be the best one? Because that, I think, is a very important thing that not a lot of first time authors really consider at the time is, the right publishing house. And you think, oh, I'll just publish to Moonberg or Tor or Forge or any of the major publishing houses. You could, but you also have to consider where your book falls into those publishing houses, because each of those houses specialize in certain books, and
Mhm.
it really has to fit that mold. So for you, Matt, how much research did you do to really find the press house that you knew this was the right home for not just Sorcery for Beginners, but the other two books in the series?
Yeah, and I should say definitely a couple things before I jump into it. One, I don't feel like I'm the best business expert at novels, so all this is just kind of my personal experience.
Right.
The other thing is, if I could go back and redo it, I would do it a lot differently when that first book came out. In terms of research, I mean, my goal originally, because I had had several friends who had published novels, and almost all traditional. I did have a couple friends who had done them on their own, and I wanted to do the traditional publishing experience. I wanted that kind of, I think that's what everyone kind of wants, is like to be that
Yes.
person. It's like they pluck you out of obscurity. Your novel's like on the table at Barnes and Noble. Like I think that's the dream for everybody. So I tried that, and I spent a couple of years kind of querying agents, and I got some really positive responses. Um, but then the whole time I was querying, as I was drafting the novel, Inkshares had kind of come on my radar, and they had a place where you could kind of upload a couple of drafts of chapters for people, and to kind of give you feedback. And I was like, I'll put a few chapters up and see what people say. And I don't know, a few weeks after doing that, I got a call from the head of the publishing house, Adam Gomelin, and he was like, "What is going on with this book? Like, what? This is a great title. I love these chapters. Where are the rest? Where's the rest of it?" And so I was like, well, sure, I'll show it to you. And as I was kind of querying agents, he would like call me every couple of weeks. And again, it wasn't like this traditional, like you said, one of the big five, with like the giant skyscraper in New York
Right.
City. But he just kept, showing me he was really excited about it and was talking about it. And he's like, I just finished another chapter. This is amazing. And so at a certain point, I was talking to my friend Nora, who had had a big 3-book deal with, I think, Simon Schuster. And they printed 25,000 copies of her first book, which was huge. It was in Target, like it was in all these giant places. And it did okay. It did fine. She earned out. But then the second novel, because she didn't like pop in a huge way, they literally were just like, okay, well, they didn't like do anything for it.
Wow.
So even though she had this 3-book deal she'd signed, they kind of just took the second and third books and just kind of they printed them, they put them out. They didn't really put any money into marketing. So seeing that and talking to her, she was like, I think you should go with the person who is excited. And I think that's always good advice in anything, like, because I think if the person's excited, it kind of doesn't really matter how big they are, because an
Right.
excited person can get a lot farther than some giant person at some company who's not interested at all. And like, you're one of 500 clients they have, or 500 books they're putting out that year. So I ended up doing that. And I think that ended up being a great experience because Adam really pushed it. He's the one that actually got he found a production company and was like, you got to hire Matt to adapt this. You got to hire him to do it. So like, that was all him. It wasn't me. It wasn't my reps or anything. So I feel like I kind of owe him a lot for that. Like, he really did push those first couple books.
That's incredible. And I loved how, as you say, we got to take into consideration the small press houses because, as you say, it doesn't matter, how big they are, how small they are. If the person is passionate and they're reaching out to you, like if they're the head of the publishing house and they really want to know more about your book, consider them because a passionate person, as you said, is going to go far. And ultimately, a lot of my guests that I've had on the show who are traditionally published, who have gone with smaller press houses, they say the exact same thing. The people are very, very passionate. They're very intrigued by the story. And these press houses deserve just as much love and admiration as the other major publishers in New York, the big five. It's really, really important to help these small and local press houses because going back again, doesn't matter how big or small they are, if they're passionate, go with them. They are really going to help you go far.
Yeah. And I don't think readers really care. I think it's like readers, they go towards a book if the concept is interesting, if the cover looks good, if the writing is good. That's what they'll respond to a book. We have so many examples of that, like The Martian, which was originally self-published, or like Dungeon Crawler Carl, which was
Yes.
self-published and now is breaking out, or like Chuck Tingle, who was doing like weird erotica and is now like publishing at a big publishing house. Like all those authors built up their own audiences and people responded to the work. I don't think anyone's like, "Ooh, I can't wait to get the new Simon Schuster book." They're like, "Who is this author? What is the concept? What are they going towards?" So, yeah. I mean, I'd still love to do it. It'd be amazing to like, have a big publisher be like, "This is the book that we're putting all our efforts and money into for the fall season." Like, that would be awesome. But in the meantime, it's like you just got to kind of find the people who are excited.
Definitely 100%. And now, turning to the audience, what are your thoughts on this match? So, when you began writing this book, did you consider, who your prospective audience was? Because, for us authors, we're the target audience first and foremost. We know the story better than anyone else. And I'm wondering, with your background as a screenwriter as well as film and television, that kind of gave you a leg up because you were able to see, okay, this is what the audience, the viewer, is interested in, these certain traits in storytelling in media. Maybe I can apply that to my writing in my books.
Yeah, I definitely thought about that. And I again remember talking to some people who had done middle grade books, and I was kind of like, what are the guidelines? Because like with films, you kind of have like the ratings, so you kind of
Right.
understand it's like this is a PG movie, this is a PG-13 movie, this is an R movie. And my friend Paula Yu basically gave me a really good guideline. She's like, first of all, readers read up. So if you have kids that are 8, 9, 10, 11, they want to read about 13-year-olds. And then 13-year-olds want to read about 16 and 17-year-olds, you know? So knowing that I was kind of aiming for that like 8 to 10 middle grade
Mm.
audience, she just made me realize, all right, you don't want to have cursing. You don't want to have like bloody, gory violence. You don't want to have sex or drugs or anything like that. And I was like,
Right.
no problem. I think the only thing that I would have maybe changed had I not known that would have maybe the kids would have cursed a little bit more because I don't know if you have kids, I have kids, like they curse a lot. Which is one of the things I loved about the Goonies is like it felt like these are real kids. These aren't like movie sanitized kids. This is how kids
Right.
actually interact with each other. But that was fine. I actually think it's more fun sometimes. And I'm writing a fun adventure story. It's not a drama. So I actually think it's more fun to come up with interesting curses. Like calling someone a D-hole to me is funnier than calling them, an actual curse word.
Absolutely. And kind of on that, now focusing on the readership, I think the readership is a very important and I think underappreciated aspect when it comes to marketing as well as, the writing process. Because what I mean by that, viewers and listeners, is that yes, you want to target for your specific audience. But within that audience, it's of course who's going to read your book. Because I'm sure you definitely agree, Matt, especially for this type of book in this bracket, there are certain stories that are marketed towards, the young adult category. But upon reading certain young adult books, you realize this needed another review because it's not young adult. This is more so of new adult or adult fiction. So for you, Matt, how difficult would you say was the process of writing, for a younger audience as opposed to, writing a book that's somewhere like in the middle? It's not adult, but it's not young adult, but both can enjoy it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like I was lucky in that, again, my natural voice, I think, tends to skew a little towards that kind of audience already.
Mm,
Like even when I was writing scripts and stuff, I was doing a lot of comedies, and I wasn't doing things that were like really edgy or a super adult or gritty or anything like that. That's never kind of been my voice. My voice has always been kind of fun and escapist. So I feel like for the most part, I was able to kind of slot once I had those guardrails, those guidelines of like no cursing, no sex, no drugs. I was able to keep it pretty tight. There were a couple of things where the publisher, I remember, we had some scenes that were a little too scary or creepy that we pulled back on
mm.
a little bit. Um, and even people who kind of were beta readers, some people were like, that feels like there's a thing in early on in Sorcery for Beginners where they miscast a spell and they remove a kid's mouth. And
Ooh,
yeah, and it felt like to me that was like scary, but it wasn't like, it's not like his face is off and there's blood and gore everywhere. But we did have some beta readers who were like, that feels maybe too scary. And so we just kind of changed some of the wording about how we described it and what the reaction was like. So it didn't feel like it was this horrible, lasting trauma, that had been imposed on this kid. It was like a mistake. They fix it, they move on.
nice. And as a sort of like a kind of fun question, and this one I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on. A lot of my guests, have very much the same background as you. I should say some, Matt, in terms of like, they start off as screenwriters and then went into the publishing industry writing their own stories. And I'll give an example of Brian Fitzpatrick, who wrote Metcraft, which is a great story.
I actually know Brian.
And
He and I were both at Ink Shares together.
oh, sweet. Then this actually is very perfect. So in Brian's interview, he told me that, for him as a screenwriter, when it came to writing his own book, it was a little bit easier for him in a sense that, for screenwriters, and again, I'm paraphrasing what he said, is that for screenwriters, we have to be very imaginative. We have to make it entertaining. Brian wanted to talk about ultimately how for screenwriters making something that is cinematic in the screenwriting world is a little bit easier when it comes to writing a novel because we're already used to writing in that style. Was that kind of the same way for you?
I would say no. I mean, that's awesome. I felt like it was a very hard transition. Like I said, I had not really written prose in, God, maybe 15, 20 years. Like I was writing prose and stuff in high school. And then I kind of went and I spent 15 years like really focused on screenwriting and trying to teach myself how to boil everything down. Like I remember my first screenplays, I used to have like a whole paragraph just describing the room. And then it was like, you don't need any of that. You can use like 2 words, or even in the slug line, just write a filthy Starbucks. Like that's all you need. And so I had really trained myself to pull back on all that detail. And then I went back to books and it was like, oh my God, you absolutely have to put all that back in. But again, not overdoing it, not being overly flowery, but you have to paint the picture. You can't rely on a props department or a set dresser or anything like that to fill in the gaps for you. And then figuring out how to do that, it took a while. So I feel like that's why it took me 4 years from when I had that idea to kind of finishing the book in 2016.
Mm,
It just was a really hard, it was kind of like, I kind of describe it to people as like, I was really used to running sprints, because screenplays are short. There's a lot of air in them. They're 90 to 120 pages. Novels, especially middle grade, are like 50,000 words to like 75,000 words.
right.
So suddenly it was like, oh my God, this is taking me forever. I used to be able to write 10 screenplay pages in a session. Now I'm writing 2 pages of prose. And so it was just like retraining myself to like run marathons now instead of sprints. And eventually I get better at that. I got faster. So now I can kind of crank out prose and I can switch back and forth. But it was I think a hard several years of transition of really trying to kind of divide my brain into those two types of writing.
Definitely, 100%. And sorry, my writing was very more of academic, very magazine writing. But when I went into my first, okay, is that better? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's good. Okay, I had to use my phone hotspot to take care of the Wi-Fi. So there may be little delay, but we should be okay.
Okay.
All right, so don't worry. All of this stuff from now will be cut out. So,
Sure.
okay, now I'll restart the question. So the question that I had from a previous author, shout out to Eric Bowden. He, told me this really cool thing that, for us authors, we want to show, respect and reverence to the stories that we grew up with, but we also want to show our individuality in our writing. And he gave an example of, we see books that have the tagline, the next so and so, or this meets that. And from a reader, that's enticing, but from a author, it's not really good in the sense that we don't want to be pigeonholed into one certain box or one style of writing. Yes, there is going to be a genre of writing that we are most comfortable in, but we don't want to limit ourselves to just that style of writing. We want to show that we can be diverse in our writing, that we can touch other genres, get other readers, and so forth. So ultimately, Matt, for you, how did you sort of balance this sort of scales, so to speak, your individuality as a screenwriter and author, but also showing respect and reverence to the stories that you grew up with, as well as the authors that you were very fond of as a child?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, I think that it's a really good thing to think about, and I think because I jumped around to so many different genres and types of storytelling, I've never had kind of like the one person that I feel like I'm like this person. It's like I'm like the Stephen King of the whatever this generation. And so in a way, I feel like I've been kind of lucky with that so that I can kind of do different stuff. I think sometimes, especially when you're starting out, like if you have a book that comes out and it becomes a giant success, it's like now you're kind of locked in to that, whatever that is. And so I think the nice thing about like Sorcery came out, it did well, but it wasn't like a giant, like you have to do a 7 book series now. So I was able to go off and do other stuff. Like I actually have a dystopian detective novel for adults that I wrote several years ago that's actually going to be coming out next year through an indie publisher. And so that'll be cool to like expand into that different audience. And again, I've been able to do like plays and stuff like that as well. So I think sometimes it's nice to be able to fly under the radar because you can try different things and there's not like this big audience that like, who is this guy? How dare he do this thing when this is the thing that I like over here that he does? Um, and maybe that'll happen at some point. But I've been able to I have a horror feature that I wrote last year that's been going around right now. So that's another thing that's like feels totally different. I think partially what I've learned to do is I still feel like I have a similar voice. Like I think everything I do is kind of fun and escapist, and it has kind of a supernatural element to it. I'm never going to be the guy that does like Sundancey stuff or writes like a novel that's all inside somebody's head in like a
Right.
period kind of setting. So I think I still, within all that, I still have like a kind of a voice that is particularly mine that I've kind of gotten into over the last few years. I hope that answers your question. I mean, in terms of authors that I really like I love Kurt Vonnegut, but I don't think I sound at all like Kurt Vonnegut. And I love like Philip Pullman, but I also think I don't write like Philip Pullman. I think the closest I really like Jason Pargin, who did John Dies at the End. That's probably the closest in terms of my voice. I feel like when I read that book, I was like, oh my God, this is how I can write for adults. Like it was very inspiring to me to read those books.
Definitely, 100%, Matt. And I'm just looking at the time right now, so I'm going to combine the last three questions together into one question that's in a three-part. So brace yourself. So, we've talked about the audience, we've talked about readers, we talked about, sort of understanding your book and where it fits into the brackets of readership. And ultimately, we've talked about a lot of many things, which I am very excited to learn from you. And ultimately, one of the most important things I think all authors need to understand when they get into this industry, and I've learned that myself, is that there's no guarantee your first book is going to give your overnight success, no matter what pathway you go to. And by that, I mean, do you want to be an author or be known as an author? Because for me, one is dedicated to the art of storytelling, the other is dedicated to the art of marketing. They could be whatever you want it to be, but they all have the same end goal. And sometimes for first-time authors, the second path is the most enticing. And that leads to unrealistic goals. So it may also deflate an author when they don't attain their goals, and that can turn their passion for writing into no longer driven by the story, but just driven by money.
Right.
So ultimately, Matt, what is your thoughts on this topic that in this industry there's no guarantee your first book's going to give you the overnight success you want, but it shouldn't deter you if you truly want to be a storyteller. And also, as a storyteller, we grow as we, continue to hone our craft. So are there any people you would like to give a shout out to that have really helped you hone your craft? And ultimately, everything you've learned, what is your word of wisdom to fellow authors as well as fellow screenwriters who want to get a head start?
Yeah, a lot of good stuff in there. I feel like in terms of advice, the stuff that's really worked for me is it's kind of a two-pronged thing. One is keep working and like keep revising. Because when I first started writing, I would write something and I'd finish and then I wouldn't go and rewrite it. And nothing would ever happen. And the first thing that I wrote that really started getting some traction, I had rewritten a bunch of times. And so I think tricking your brain into that mindset is really important, that like, writing is rewriting. You need to work on something a lot. You need to show it to people, which is kind of part of the second thing. So like keep writing, keep revising, and then you have to put stuff out there at a certain point. I have friends, unfortunately, who are really good writers, but like they have been working on the same novel for 10 years. And I'm much more of the belief of like, try and get stuff out as quickly as I can. Still make it good, like don't, and I can kind of now I've trained myself to listen to the little naggy voice inside me that's like, that's not quite right yet. Like you haven't figured that out. You got to keep working on that.
Right.
But when I do feel like I've gotten it to a point as good as I can get it, then it's time to send it out, show it to people. And I definitely feel like as I've been writing novels, I have gotten better with each one. Like one of the things that was really cool to see was my second novel, Cryptozoology for Beginners, got better reviews. It's like it's better than it's got a higher score on Goodreads than the first one. And so I think that's good. because it's like, yeah, it can be very easy to like, you have your first thing comes out, and if it is a success, like you're saying, it can be easy to be lazy about it and just like give the people what they want. And I think you have to kind of be your toughest critic in a way. And we've seen that with tons of people.
Right.
Like they get to a certain level of success and there's just nobody to tell them no. And so they're kind of suddenly the quality of their work falls off. So I really try to keep that in mind. The other thing I'll say, and I was very, I guess, kind of lucky in this respect. I had an experience very early on as a writer. Because again, I was writing stuff when I was in high school and sending stuff out. And I would send these things out to like real magazines. I would write a short story and send it to a real literary magazine. And they didn't know that I was 16. And I would get these very mean rejection letters. Like, why are you wasting my time? This is terribly written. Like, show this to somebody. And so I would get that and I would get very depressed and I wouldn't write anything for like 2 months. But then I would find myself thinking of another idea and going back to writing. And so after about 7 years of that happening, of me sending something out, getting rejected, nothing happening, being depressed, finding my way back to writing, I was like, you know what? This is just whatever it is. I just am going to do it. It's like a compulsion. I literally just want to entertain myself by writing. Literally, I'm the kind of person who, if I go on vacation for a week, after 4 days of sitting on a beach, I'm like, I'm going to go to a coffee shop and do some writing, you know? So once I realized that about myself, it kind of freed me up from the whole success aspect of it, because I was like, this is the bare baseline. I'm going to keep cranking stuff out, whatever it is, novels, plays, whatever. And if nothing ever happens and I just stick them in a box in my attic and my kids find them 30 years later and they're like, oh, Dad was a writer? Weird. Is that okay? And the answer for me was, yeah.
Right.
Because I had fun doing it. I was, like you said, I was entertaining myself. And once I accepted that about myself, suddenly everything that kind of came along with it was gravy, you know? It was anything that's above that is like, wow, this is great. Like I'm already above what the baseline was. So like the first time I published a book, I was like, I never thought I'd publish a book, and now I've published a book. I never thought I'd get hired to adapt it as a screenplay, and I got hired to adapt it. And so it's like all that stuff feels like just kind of extra on top of it. And if people can, if writers especially can get into that mindset, I think they're going to feel a lot healthier.
Absolutely, 100%, Matt, and a perfect ending to this amazing author interview. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another author interview here on the channel. A huge thank you to Matt for telling us all about his works with the Sorcery for Beginners series, as well as the other 2 books in the series, as well as adapting it into a screenplay and potentially a movie down the road. We'll just have to wait and see. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, and I can't wait to tell you my thoughts on Sorcery for Beginners when I get to reading it.
Cool. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks so much, Gabriel.
You're welcome, Matt. And as always, viewers and listeners, like, subscribe, and comment below what is your favorite part of the interview, as well as what was your favorite book growing up. And let's make it interesting. Magical based book. That could be sorcery, that could be wizards, that could be anything. Comment down below and let me know your thoughts. Until next time, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day.